One of the really interesting things about 5th edition, how we run it, is, and this is something I've been started to think about recently, is the idea that like two kind of cases that are true. One, the DM's game, the GM's game is different than the player's game. That what we're doing, I know this is like, oh, Captain Obvious, thank you. But like the kind of game that we're playing as a GM is really different than the kind of game players are playing. Right? There was this old joke of like, a bassist and a guitarist never really paid attention to what the other one was doing. They're like, guitarists don't talk to the bassist. Don't do that. Yeah, you're both playing the same song, but you're doing totally different things. And that idea of like the GM side of it, I've often said, like, I don't really pay attention to what's going on the player side, right? I'm worried about what the GM side is. I don't nitpick about their characters. I don't, rarely do I kind of dive in and do things. Like yesterday, I had it where a guy who was brand new was going to do a move, and I was like, you have a dragon breath. You could actually move over here and hit those guys with dragon breath. How's that sound? Trying to say, like, that's an option that you might not have known about. And he didn't. He was a brand new player. And he's like, yeah, I definitely want to do that. But generally speaking, it's like we're playing a different kind of game. It's almost like we're playing two different games at the table. The game that the GM is playing and the games that the players are playing. Now we're all mixing together, and obviously we have sort of one shared story, and I'm not losing fact of that, but there is this idea that we're playing a different kind of game. The other thing is because of that, because of the idea that the GM side is just fundamentally different than what players are doing, we can change all kinds of stuff on the GM side that doesn't affect the player side, or ideally only affects it in a positive way. What is a simple example of this is, if you think about it, the player would have like a copy of the D&D 2014 Player's Handbook, and that's what they're using to run their D&D character during a 5th edition D&D game. And on our side, we have the D&D 5th edition Dungeon Master's Guide and the D&D 5th edition Monster Manual. And we are using the Dungeon Master's Guide to help us build adventures. And we're using the Monster Manual to come up with interesting monsters and use those stat blocks for those monsters. All of those components, those 3 books, the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon Master's Guide, and the Monster Manual, are all independent of one another. You can pull out any one of those and replace it with a different one, and the game still runs. And I have done this, and many people have done this, that I'm just going to take that 2014 Monster Manual, set it aside, and I'm going to take in this new shiny Flea Mortals that just came out. And I'm going to open up Flea Mortals, and now I'm running mummies that zip around and punch people in the face repeatedly, and hobgoblins that are on fire, running around people, burning them up with fire, and 100 minions chasing after the characters, and huge solo monsters that are just wrecking the world. And they're like, and the player side, they're like, what the hell? What are these guys about? Like, I had players like, is that a legendary action? I'm like, no, that is a villain action. They're like, what's a villain action? I'm like, that's an action that they can do between anyone else's turn, but they can only do it once, but it hits like a nuclear bomb. And they're like, oh, right? And so that, you can replace that. And then you could say, I'm going to take Flea Mortals, and I'm going to set that aside. And then I'm going to pull in, a fine book called Forge of Foes. And now I don't even need monster stat blocks. I have tables and powers that I can use during the game. This book is so beautiful. It's totally wrong for me to like love my own book, but I love this book so much. But it's a whole different way of thinking about how you run monsters in your 5th edition game. And you could run it on your side. And I've done this. I've replaced it. And then sometimes I've had like some monsters in a battle are from Flea Mortals. Another set of monsters are from Forge of Foes. And some are just normal monsters. And I'm like, can you tell which are which? And like, no, not really. Like lots of crazy stuff was happening. But I couldn't tell you which one was which book. Like I didn't see a stylistic difference so much that I couldn't tell which one was which. And that's because you can flop all of these different things out. The same is true with the Dungeon Master's Guide. You could say, hey, the Dungeon Master's Guide has the kind of stuff in it. And also it is the least liked book of the 3 core books. I think that's certainly true. A lot of people are not fans of the Dungeon Master's Guide. I actually think it's not as bad as we think it is. I think it's actually not bad. It's not organized, and it doesn't help you be a good GM, I don't think. But it gives you a lot of tools. It gives you a lot of capabilities, lots of tables, and lots of ways to kind of build adventures. But obviously there are people who want different things and have different things. And that's where you can say like, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull out that Dungeon Master's Guide, and I'm going to replace it with Level Up Advanced 5e's Trials and Treasure Book, which is essentially their Dungeon Master's Guide. And I'm going to put other components in the game in this for things like journey activities or random encounter tables or interesting environments that the characters are exploring or ways to buy magic items or better downtime rules. All kinds of stuff that exists in this book, which is an excellent, excellent book, that I can bring right into my game. And I don't even have to ask the players at my table for permission. I can just do it. I can just add this stuff in the same way that I can add monsters from any monster book and drop them into my game. I don't have to get anybody's permission to flop out these pieces, which means the GM side of the table is ours to do whatever we want with, right? We can say, sure, I'm going to use stuff from the Dungeon Master's Guide, or this is show and tell time, by the way, or I can use Uncharted Journeys to handle exploration ideas, right? Great big thick book, it's like 300 pages. It's big. It's bigger. It's as big as the Dungeon Master's Guide is. Not quite. Yeah, it's about 288 pages. Great big book offering different ideas and styles and encounters to make travel more interesting in your games. You can just drop this in. Now, I don't think I'm saying anything that's a big surprise to people. I think it's about how we think about it that really changes. That when we think about the game that we're playing, on the GM side, I showed Patrick Paladin's portrait mode lazy GM screen inserts. You can pretty much just use those and run sessions of your game. It's got pretty much everything you need and just 3 or 4 things. You can use the Lazy DM's companion to help you build entire campaigns. You can use millions of tables from Raging Swan for the stuff that Raging Swan makes in your games. We've never really thought of it this way when we do homebrew adventures, or if we say like, oh, I'm going to run Dungeons of Drakkenheim, that I'm making my own 5e on my side. But that's really what we're doing. We are building 5e on our side, however we want it, however we think it will be most fun for us and the players at our table. So the tip that I'm really offering here is just to think about your game differently. Think about your game as on your side of the table, on behind your screen, what you're running when you're running at the table. You can flip and flop and pull out stuff and drop stuff in and try stuff and homebrew your own stuff or pick up one idea that you read on a blog somewhere. There's so much stuff that you can do on the GM side to change how the game operates, the tools you use, physical tools, how you use your dice tower, Dwarven Forge, drawable dry erase mats, little tile cards, stand-up 2D, 2.5D pawns for your miniatures. All of these things you can just try to build the kind of game you want to build on your side. And the nice thing about that is you can do all of that stuff and not really have to affect your players. That the game that they're playing is going to be different on their side. They're going to see different monsters. They're going to see new tools and accessories. They're going to run different adventures. All these different things are going to change from how they interact with it. But from the rules that they understand, they could just be sitting there with the 2014 version of the Player's Handbook, the Dungeon D&D Player's Handbook, and still enjoying this whole new world that you can build out with your monsters from Flee Mortals and your ad hoc monsters from Forge of Foes and your weird adventure builds that you got from the Lazy DM's Companion and journey rules that you picked up from Uncharted Journeys and new ways to fund the creation of magic items from Trials and Treasure. All of these different ways that they can interact with the game, and it doesn't have to change on their side. So that to me is a really, really powerful way of thinking about and this is specific to 5e. We're not even getting into other RPGs, but just in how you're able to change things on the GM side of 5e. I think it fills me with a lot of hope and a lot of joy. It makes me really happy to know that we can munge around on that side of it as much as we want, trying new things in and out, trying different products in and out, finding ideas and bringing them in and change all that stuff. I would say the only sort of warning here is make sure that you're open to that. Make sure that you are not so focused on the tools that you use that the only way you can incorporate those things is either paying a lot of money or you can't because you're wired into a particular platform that doesn't allow it. And I'm not just bashing on D&D Beyond here either. Like if you're just so wired into Roll20, but Roll20 doesn't have that monster book you really love, learn how to run monsters just from anything, from a PDF or from a physical book. Stay flexible and make sure that your approach towards the game is flexible enough to be able to drop in all of these things and not be dependent upon I can only use it if it's ever compatible with X, this like tool X. You don't want to have a situation like that because then you are limiting yourself severely to the wide range of different things that are out there. Of course, we want to keep communication open with our players. So as we're changing these kinds of things, it probably behooves us to let our players know. For example, if you're running a action-oriented boss monster from Flea Mortals, it can help you to explain what the general mechanics are for that monster so that players understand what's happening. It's kind of fun when they're like, I don't know what's going on. In the same way that you'd want to explain that a monster is a legendary monster so they're not blowing a bunch of spells that they normally blow. I know there's probably GMs that are like, no, don't ever tell them anything. I believe in sharing information as much as possible. I think in the same way you could explain how Flea Mortals minions work. You can explain how Flea Mortals legendary monsters work. They're action-oriented monsters work. So that the players get an idea of what is going on that other side. So I'm not saying that you can keep them completely in the dark, but the main thing is you can change huge pieces of your side of it, and it isn't going to change the player's approach towards the game that much. If you enjoyed this show and you want to get more stuff like this from me, the best way to do so is to subscribe to the Sly Flourish newsletter. It's absolutely free to sign up. There is a link in the show notes, and you get a free adventure generator for signing up. And every week you get an RPG-related newsletter, which has links to all of the other things I do, plus like an RPG-related topic of the week. Really fun newsletter. People really like it. And absolutely free. You can also subscribe to me on Patreon. Support me on Patreon. You get access to all kinds of exclusive stuff like the Q&A, a dedicated Discord server, tons of material to run for your RPGs, tons of tools to help you run your RPGs, all different kinds of stuff that patrons get for a very, very low price. And it helps support my show. And you can pick up any of my books, including Forge of Foes, Return to the Lazy Dungeon Master, Lazy Games Workbook, Lazy Games Companion, and all the fantastic books, coffee cups, t-shirts, calendars. They're all available in the Sly Flourish Bookstore. You can find a link to the Sly Flourish Bookstore in the notes. Thank you so much. Have a great day, and get out there and play an RPG.